In this lecture set, we're going to look at asteroids and meteorites, and the next lecture set will cover comets and conclude with what the asteroids and comets tell us about the formation of the solar system 4.6 billion years ago. I have a whole separate chapter in the textbook about solar system fluff, and by that I mean the small objects in our solar system much smaller than most of the major moons, planets, and of course, than the sun. Even though they are small, they have an outsized role of importance to us for figuring out how our solar system formed. And that's because the sun, planets, and most of the major moons have been really geologically active and have removed their birth records. Therefore, if we look at just the planets and their compositions, we have a hard time figuring out what it was like 4.6 billion years ago when the solar system was forming. In contrast, most of the asteroids and all of the comets are primitive objects, which in this context means they haven't changed chemically since they solidified or formed 4.6 billion years ago. Most of the asteroids and all of the comets have not erased their birth records. The first slide starts with a description of the asteroids in general. These are millions of boulder to city-sized chunks of rock, most with orbits between Mars and Jupiter. The largest asteroid series is about 1,000 kilometers in diameter, large enough to be considered a dwarf planet, but most of the asteroids are much smaller, under 100 kilometers, so city size or smaller. The plot at the top of the lecture slide shows the orbit of Jupiter as the outermost blue circle, and the next orbit inside is for Mars, and then the smallest orbit shown is for Earth. The Sun is at the very center. At this scale, we're not concerned about Mercury and Venus. The black dots were all the asteroids that were known at the time that the plot was made over 2 decades ago. You can go to the Minor Planet Center website and bring up a much more recent plot that has a lot more of the asteroids found with known orbits, including the ones colored red here with orbits that cross Earth's orbit. On the first plot, notice the group of dots that are on either side of the green dot of Jupiter. These are the Trojan asteroids that are in the same orbit as Jupiter's orbit around the Sun, so they take the same amount of time to go around the Sun. Remember in Kepler's third law relating the orbit size and the orbit period, that the orbit period just depends on the size of the orbit and the mass of the central object, which is, in this case, of course, the Sun, because they're orbiting the Sun. The Trojan asteroids orbit in the gravitational balance points called Lagrange points that are 60 degrees ahead and 60 degrees behind Jupiter. But most of the asteroids have orbits in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Those asteroids that have orbits crossing Earth's orbit are the potentially hazardous asteroids because they could hit Earth in the far future. As far as we know right now, there are no asteroids larger than 140 meters across that will hit Earth within the next 100 years. The 3 types of asteroids are designated by their composition: the S, M, and C asteroids. S, for silicates, are like the regular sort of Earth rock you'd find here on the surface of the Earth. Here's a picture showing 3 examples of some S-type asteroids that have been visited up close by spacecraft: Eros, Gasper, and Ida. The M-type ones are M for metals, mostly iron and nickel, like you'd find in the cores of the terrestrial planets, and then the C-type asteroids made of carbon compounds. An example of a C-type asteroid is Matilda. Actually, the C-type asteroids are very dark. They're darker, blacker than charcoal, and so in this image of Matilda, it's been brightened by a factor of 6 times to make it easily visible. As you'd expect, asteroid researchers use much more detailed chemical subdivisions of the asteroids than just the 3 that we have here, but for our purposes in this class, these 3 will work just fine. S, M, C tells you what they're made of. Researchers of the Potentially Hazardous Asteroids group their asteroids by their orbit characteristics because it's their orbits that make them dangerous, not their compositions. Here's a picture of the first asteroid discovered to be a binary asteroid, Ida, a big asteroid that has a little tiny moon going around it called Dactyl. Pretty much everywhere in the universe you have smaller things orbiting bigger things. We now know of over 400 binary asteroids, that is, two asteroids orbiting each other, and several triple asteroids. Further down the lecture slide are pictures of Ceres and Vesta, the two largest asteroids in terms of mass. There is another asteroid called Juno that's in between the size of Ceres and Vesta, but doesn't have quite as much mass as Vesta. The largest asteroid, Ceres, has enough mass that it is considered a dwarf planet, which means it has enough gravitation, enough internal gravity to compress itself into the most compact shape possible in three-dimensional space, which is a sphere. Most of the asteroids are these potato-shaped things with very irregular shapes because they do not have enough mass for their internal gravity to overcome the strength of the rock material of which the asteroid is made. The objects that are large enough to compress themselves down into spheres also had enough internal heat sometime in their past to be geologically active. They'll have some very interesting geologic features besides being just a beat-up, cratered rock. On the right image, you see that even the largest of the asteroids are much smaller than our Moon, and certainly much smaller than Mercury and Mars.